What cruelty makes a noble neck bow like a broken bell? In the market's harsh dawn, where men sell and men measure souls by silver, there stood a horse so thin that wind seemed to pass through him like an accusation. His ribs were a fretwork of old debts. His eyes were two dark moons that knew hunger, as one knows an old friend. Who would buy a body with so much silence in it? Who would wager hope upon a creature shorn of pride? Attend then this question that cuts like a stage knife. When a beast once bred for speed and sun is bartered for pennies and pity, does the heart that loved him lie buried with his lost oats? Or does some ember remain, stubborn and secret, that can kindle the impossible? The market cried its bargains. Voices rose and fell like gulls over storm water. Men spat judgments. Children pointed. Yet beneath the dust and the jeer there was a scar upon one foreleg, white as an old resolve, and a chain, light now of use but heavy in memory, looped about his halter like a promise refused. What tale hides in that scar? What wrong, what shame, what refusal? The crowd believed they saw only a carcass dressed as horse. But there are hearts, human and beast, that keep the grammar of courage even when the tongue of fortune is cut. He nodded once as if to say, "See me, though you would rather not," and a small unremarked hand tucked a scrap of bread beneath the stall's shadow. The hand trembled with hunger of a different sort, not for bread but for a companion lost to the ledger. A voice, hoarse with the weight of years, asked aloud what no one meant to hear, "Who will take the starved one?" And the market answered with laughter. Yet laughter, like winter, can crack the ground and reveal something green beneath. Who would have thought that the hush after mockery might be the drumbeat before a rebellion? End with a question, and the question will walk with us. When the gavel falls and the last coin is counted, what will rise from that pale-flanked body? Shame, salvation, or a doom that will swallow the proudest vows? In a village hemmed by herds and hedgerow, where lanes smelled of hay and distant sea, lived Alden, a man whose hands had once known only the language of careful tending. He kept his distance from rumor and the market's sharp tongue. His life was a ledger of small mercies: mended fences, the righting of one wronged sheep, the washing of a child's shirt until it smelled of summer again. Once he had ridden a better horse than any now paraded in the auction's slatted light. Once that mount had carried him across a green world and into a future that tasted of spring. But time, that subtle burglar, had taken name and kin, leaving Alden with a hollow that would not stitch itself. Alden's sorrow was not loud. It was a small inward weather that made him wake early, hands empty, listening for a hoofbeat that would not come. He had a habit, kept from friends and hidden beneath his coat, of speaking to an old photograph of a thin-haired mare whose eyes still glowed in paper as if the sun remained bottled in that pale rectangle. He did not explain his grief. He acted it. He rose when dawn was just a rumor. He broke no promise to the animals he tended, and he carried the quiet dignity of one who has been refused the miracle he expected. The village called him steady. He called himself waiting. The world in which he lived had rules as old as the hedges. A horse was worth what it could do: haul, sprint, breed. Sentiment was a currency for those who could afford it. The auction yard was the marketplace of that law. Men moved like herons there, precise, patient, hungry. Voices traded in statistics: 14 hands, 4 years old, blemishless, sound behind. In such a language there was no room for a scar spoken of like poetry, or for a halter that whispered of past tenderness. A horse's worth bent like wheat beneath the weight of numbers. Alden came to the market because something in him had decided that waiting was a slow betrayal. He did not wear the ragged cloak of a sentimental fool. He wore the plain coat of someone who had counted the cost and found regret unacceptable. He moved among stalls with a care that betrayed his old riding days. He did not wish to buy an equine trophy. He wished to rescue a heartbeat that had been abandoned to measure and coin. This wish, secret and stubborn, had the feel of a vow made at midnight to a tomb. It was foolish, perhaps, but it was the only thing that kept him from folding into nothing. There was talk of the starved horse long before Alden saw him. Whispers passed like cold weather: a cursed nag, a spent racer, a man's poor investment. Names did what names always do. They made him smaller. Yet when Alden crossed the lot and the animal looked up, the harsh geometry of the auction yard seemed to falter. The horse's nostrils lifted like a pair of small flags. His ears half torn from a life of poor living, rotated with ancient politeness toward the sound of a human voice. He smelled of rain-damp straw and the iron of diluted blood. A scar, faint and pale, cut a white line along his right foreleg, a vowel of its own in the grammar of injury. The chain that bound his halter was slack. It hung like a necklace of failed promises. Alden studied him without flattery. He saw the way the animal shifted weight from one foreleg to the other, the tiny tick in the jaw that told of malnourishment, the dull sheen of a coat that had once been the black of midnight. He noted the long bones that spoke of races run or battles born, or of a lineage that had been asked too much. He thought of the photograph he kept folded in the lining of his pocket, and could not help but imagine how that mare's strength might have birthed a new steadiness in this starved frame. There was no sentimentality beyond the fact of recognition. This body had been made to carry more than it had been allowed. When the auctioneer's voice rose like a bell, Alden found his fingers tightening around the strap of his satchel. He did not come prepared for war. He had coins, yes, but not the arrogance of a bidder who treats life as a commodity. He felt rather like a man standing before an altar with one small offering. He had learned the market's arithmetic. Sometimes mercy requires a coin even its giver cannot spare. Thus the stage was set, the village's harsh sunlight, the horse's humiliated body, Alden's compact determination, the ordinary world, the hedged lanes, the chickens clucking news, the rhythm of plow and prayer, had given way to a spectacle where decisions would be made in seconds and fates signed in ink and coin. Somewhere in that compressed moment, the story's central creditor, shame, waited to be repaid or forgiven. Who among those gathered would be the accountant of this broken ledger? The auction began in the old cadence, a roll call of poor prospects, a parade of promise and false teeth. Men called lots like priests counting rosary beads. Women edged their skirts in the shadow, calculating which bargain would best serve their yards. Children ran about, their laughter a bright, brittle thread among the grating voices. The starved horse was brought forward last, as if shame were a thing to be tucked away until no one would remember it. He moved slowly, each step a negotiation between courage and bone. His breath came as a thin, sibilant thing, yet when he lifted his head there was intelligence in his gaze, not wildness but recognition, as a man might greet an old debtor who now asks to be paid. Voices rose. Low start. Who'll take him at 5? The auctioneer's hand slapped the block. Men joked about what beast could be made of him. A plow horse, perhaps, or a lesson for a stubborn child. Laughter leaned in, heavy as a roof. Alden felt the air tighten as if a rope were being pulled around the lot's heart. He did not speak. He did not yet bid. He watched the horse's ears flick, alert to every breath, and in that flick there was a small, dignified protest against the world's scorn. A child slipped closer and, with the furtive bravery of the young, offered a crust. The horse took it with a gentleness that made the child step back as if the animal's politeness were a miracle. Alden moved when the price called his name between the numbers. He had not planned to buy at that moment, but something in the auctioneer's cadence, a long, expectant beat, struck a chord in him. He rose and placed a bid that drew a hush. It was not a large sum by the market's measure, but it was enough to buy the right to speak with that creature alone. A man laughed and bid higher. Another scoffed and turned away. The hammer seemed to hang then, ponderous, like a god considering mercy. Alden, with fingers that remembered reins, offered again and again until the gavel fell. The lot was his. Relief should have been light, but instead Alden felt as if he had taken a boat upon perilous water. He led the horse from the yard. The animal's ribs clicked softly against his sleeve like a metronome for sorrow. On the path away from the market, men watched and whispered. Some cursed, some pitied. Some envied the chance to make a moral standing. Yet the horse kept his head low and patient, trusting no handshake, offering no promise. That first night, Alden led him to a stable where the straw was clean and the light thin and forgiving. He spoke little. He set a bowl of water and placed a handful of hay that seemed to the horse like a banquet. The animal ate with a delicacy born of months without plenty. His lips curled around the hay as though tasting the memory of better days. At dawn, the horse trembled and raised his head, nostrils quivering at the scent of a morning that might be new. Alden watched him groom his own flank with a methodical lick, a private ceremony. He noticed how the creature flinched when he reached across the scarred foreleg, a flinch not of fear but of old pain. There was an invisible ledger in that movement, a record of punishments received and ignored. Alden probed gently, speaking in the low words of one who has mended. The horse yielded, then tightened. He let Alden touch where the scar was white and where the chain had rubbed a sore into flesh. In that instant, a tiny seed of trust darted like a moth toward a lantern. But trust, like grass, is slow to spring after drought. The village doctor, a woman whose hands were as certain with bandage as with flour, came to look. She frowned and said the word that acts as a judge in such small communities: neglect. He was starved, she declared, and the word fell with the bluntness of an axe. There was talk of law, of fines, of those who let animals suffer. A whisper braided itself into rumor. Perhaps the horse had been purposely mistreated. Perhaps a gambler had thrown him aside. People loved such stories. They are a balm to the soul's boredom. Alden felt the story's edges sting him, as if accusation could leap from lips and claw at his boots. Complication followed like a slow cloud. The horse balked at being saddled. His rib bones caught the cinch and he flinched, eyes rolling with a panic that was not present in his steady gaze. Alden tried again and again, each attempt a small humiliation and a learning. He came to know the animal's moods like one learns the pattern of a stubborn neighbor. The flinch before rain, the way his ears softened when he heard a child's voice, the snap of interest when a dog barked in the distance. Yet the horse would not take to harness with the ease Alden desired. He bolted once, not from malice but instinct, a sudden fear that made him fling his head and attempt to flee. Alden caught him, heart pounding, and felt the animal's muscles tremble with such effort that tears wet his own cheeks. A rival arose in the shape of Tom, a large man with ledger in hand and contempt in eye. Tom had once owned prize steeds and now collected trophies and stories. He visited the stable, measured the horse with a glance, and declared what many could not say otherwise. He is unsound for sport, unsightly for trade, and costly for trouble. Tom's words slid like sleet under Alden's skin. He offered prudence. Sell, he said. There are buyers who will take him for less and care for him as one would for a tool. Alden's jaw tightened. He had more to lose than coin. He had the ghost of his former riding life. If he failed to bring the horse round, he would admit defeat not merely to men but to his own memory. Time pressed. A heavy rain came that autumn, a storm with the impatience of gods. The river rose and the paths turned into brown ribbons. The horse, who hated thunder, spooked at each crack and winged noise. One night lightning struck near the stable and a bright singing fear took hold of the beast. He bolted with a force that was a miracle of muscle and terror. Alden, who had been schooling him in the yard, was jerked from his feet and pulled along the sodden earth. The halter strained, and with a sickening snap the chain broke free. The horse ran into the dark with such speed that the earth seemed to race to meet his hooves. Alden called after him, voice raw, but the animal disappeared into the night's black book like a torn page. The village woke to news as to a duel. The horse gone, the man left with a broken wrist and a hunger doubled by shame. Tom smiled thinly and said, "Perhaps he was right to leave you." Alden tended his wounds with the same hands that might one day soothe a healed flank. He felt the village's gaze as a physical pressure, yet beneath the bruise of humiliation there stirred something fiercer than regret, a determination to find what had vanished and to learn, if need be, what had been done to render a noble body willing to flee. He set out at dawn, following tracks that the rain had kissed into mud and that might betray the path of a creature who had once known speed. In the track's muddled story, a scrap of cloth caught on a bramble told of more than escape. It hinted at a hand, a struggle and a secret that would not stay hidden long. Who had touched the horse before the auction's glare? Who had made his scar into story? The question cut like a knife, and Alden, with bleeding fingers and stubborn heart, followed where the answer led. Alden found a small shoe, a child's size, pressed into the soft earth. Not the horse's, but a human's. Near it lay a fragment of a rope burned and blackened as if by a careless flame. The signs assembled a rumor. This was no simple flight. Men in the market had spoken of cruelty, but this hinted at malice deliberate and cruel. A storm-backed wind carried the echo of laughter that did not belong to the honest sort. Alden's jaw set. If someone had wronged the horse by human hand, then restitution would need a face. Tracks led toward the old fairground, a place of forgotten reels and broken banners where children's shrieks once made a world spin lighter. There in the ruined carousel's shadow the horse stood neck high and nostrils flared, a silhouette of will against ruin. Yet beside him, crouched like a guilty thing, was a man whose face Alden knew, a name whispered in taverns for cheap bargains and cheaper courage. As Alden raised his voice to call the man, the stranger flung something into the mud and laughed. It was a token, a small carved bone with a mark that matched the scar on the horse's leg. The bone clacked like a judge's gavel in Alden's chest. Had this man been the architect of the creature's shame? Or was the token proof of a more tangled past, a debt older than any auction's bill? The man stepped forward, eyes like coins, and spoke in a voice both soft and obstructive. He was never simply starved, Alden. He was trained to refuse. We broke him for reasons you do not yet know. The words were a match cast upon dry straw. Alden's heart knocked against his ribs like a prisoner. The truth revealed, before it could be understood, hinted at a cruelty so deliberate that it forced a choice. Flee the tangled business of justice, or stay and confront a secret that might cost him everything. The horse snorted, and in that breath his flared nostrils drew in a smell that Alden could not name. Iron, smoke, and something like fear braided with a memory of applause. The world narrowed to that single terrible hinge. Alden's feet found the hollow of the fairground like one who returns to a wound he cannot leave alone. The ruined carousel creaked with an old laugh. Its horses, painted and forgotten, kept their smiles for no one. The man who had spoken, Rook, the village called him for his black temper and his habit of carrying trouble like a calling card, stepped forward as if he were the story's author and not its thief. His eyes were small coins. His smile was the thin edge of a blade. Alden saw the token in his hand, the carved bone, and something in his chest went very hard. The bone matched the scar's mark, a branded knot of triangles that Rook's band used to mark animals that had been handled. Handled, Rook said, as if the word were a coin he could flip to shine or dull things. You ask why we broke him? Because some beast must be broken to fit men's machines. Because the market loves a name and we sell names cheaper this way. Because there is money in pity, and in pity there is power. He spat the last word like a seed. His confession had the terrible care of one who tidies his room before airing a crime. Alden heard the confession not as news, but as an accusation aimed at himself. Had his waiting been foolish, or had it been the last honest thing? The horse shifted. His ears were flat pins against his skull, and his nostrils flared with a scent Alden could not name. He had been called a thing to be measured, auctioned, and replaced. Now he stood in the hollow of ruin and listened to the account of his dismemberment. You trained him to refuse, Alden said at last, his voice a slow, steady weight. You made him shrink from the tack, from the hand, until kindness looked like a threat. You thought you could sell his shame twice, first to the market, then to the sin that profits on rescued beasts. Why? The question leaned like a spear. Rook laughed, and the laugh smelled of tavern smoke and cold coin. Because a horse that will not run for another man is worthless to the racetrack, but priceless to the man who wants to hide a debt. Because if you starve them and teach them to fear, the next man will buy them cheap and he will pay us for secrets. We make fools of the market and gods of ourselves. The sun, thin and ashamed, tried to peer through the clouds. Somewhere beyond the hollow, a child cried, a small sound like a jot of punctuation in a long argument. For a moment the world held its breath as Alden measured the width between a man's greed and a creature's dignity. Then Alden did what the ledger of his life had taught him. He spoke in acts and not in complaints. He moved toward the horse with a step that was not soft but honest, and he laid his palm upon the animal's neck. The horse's coat was sandpapery beneath his hand. The ribs counted like grief. His muscles twitched as if he expected a lash. For a long suspended second, he who was broken and he who offered repair measured one another by the old language of touch. Alden did not speak. He simply held. He thought of the photograph he carried in his coat, the mare who had once taught him the grammar of trust. And he let that memory be a map. Something in the horse changed as if a key had found its lock. The animal's teeth showed in a softer line. His eyes, those dark moons, shivered with recognition. He lowered the great head until his muzzle brushed Alden's wrist, the gentlest of acknowledgments. In that brush was 1,000 small promises. I remember the scent of kindness. I have not forgotten how to be proud. The carved bone Rook had tossed into the mud clattered as if to remind them both that habit is a loud thing. Rook moved then, a snake-speed motion, intended to pry the horse from the place where it had chosen a companion. He stepped forward with a hand like a trap. "He belongs to profit now," Rook hissed. "You had your chance at the market and you squandered with sentiment." Alden did not step back. Instead, he reached into his satchel and drew the folded photograph, showing the mare's sunlit eyes. He said, "This is why I will not sell him. Because he remembers what he was made for." His voice was small, but it carried. Rook's face, used to buying men's silence, contorted. "You are sentimental," he sneered. "Sentiment makes men poor and pockets thin." "Then call me poor," Alden answered, "if poverty is the currency of mercy." Rook's hand closed like a fist. It was acute of violence. The man lunged forward, intending perhaps to strike, perhaps to steal, perhaps to prove that men like him could make of cruelty a performance no one dared stop. The horse reacted as horses do when danger falls upon those they trust. A snort, a widening of the eyes, and then a movement that surprised every spectator. He stepped between Alden and the man as though to fence his human with his own body. He planted his foreleg forward, the heel of his shoe digging into the soft ground like an exclamation. The act was not heroic in the way men perform heroism. It was instinct. Protect the herd. Protect the hand that feeds kindness. But to people who had watched him shiver at a harness only nights before, it read as a reversal writ in thunder. Rook laughed, a short, incredulous sound. He reached down to shove the horse aside, but the animal, which had been trained through hunger to see hands as instruments of pain, now showed a different learned thing, the memory of an ancient bond. He pinned Rook with a look older than any market ledgers and, with the slow clarity of a creature that remembers running toward something rather than from it, reared. The rear was a statement. The horse's flanks rose and his broad chest shone with the wetness of exertion. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. Dust hung like confetti. When the horse descended, he did not flee. He did not seek to escape. He planted his hooves and shook his mane as if to say, "I will not be ordered into smallness again." The carved bone, flung earlier, skittered and caught in a horseshoe, its triangles matching the scar, its meaning changing as if iron could rewrite fate. Rook stumbled. His hand struck the wooden post of the carousel and splinters flew like tiny stars. He cursed and found himself for once out of script. The villagers, who had come curious and cynical, found in that moment a new heartbeat to mirror, a refusal to bow where bowing had been demanded. Voices rose, but not with the market's coldness. Women stepped forward, faces set like anvils. A boy clutched a rope and looked no longer like a bystander, but like one who might help. The contest, which had been framed as man against beast, shifted to become something larger, a choice between the small tyrannies men practice and the restoration of a dignity that had been taken. Alden laid his hand flat upon the horse's wither. He said nothing grand because there was no speech enough in the language of men. He only put his body where kindness had been offered, and in doing so, named the world he wished to live in. The horse, as if understanding the vow in bone-deep terms, lowered his head and placed his nose upon Alden's shoulder, a gesture so rich it felt like forgiveness and proof at once. He did not kneel, for horses rarely kneel. He stood like a sentinel whose weapons were trust and muscle. Rook, humiliated, staggered back and spat. "You will pay for this," he hissed, the threat empty as a drum with a hole. He turned and fled into the hedges, his figure folding into the gull of distance. He left behind his carved bone, the wet smear where his anger had met a mare's hoof, and a village in which the ledger of small cruelties had been, for a moment, unsettled. At the peak of the confrontation, when blood in the air seemed to settle and every breath found its place, a symbolic gesture sealed the moment. The horse stepped forward and, with the dignified slowness of one used to public judgment, he placed his foreleg gently upon the carved bone. The movement was simple and impossible both, a horse placing a boot upon a trinket like a king's foot upon the low table of shame. The gesture said more than any tribunal could. The beast reclaimed what had marked him. He turned a symbol of his abuse into a token of triumph. The crowd felt it as a chord struck in the chest and would not unhear. When the dust settled, the villagers gathered close. Some spoke of calling the law. Others whispered of ransom and recompense. Alden, who had both the photograph and the horse in his keeping, felt his world change not by coin but by a quieter instrument, the recognition that grief could be mended, that courage could be taught back into a body. He looked at the animal, not a carcass, not a commodity, but a creature with ribs like a cage and a heart like a bell. And he knew that the story had passed its hinge. What came next would be a work of slow repair. News traveled along hedgerows and hearths. The tale of the market scandal distended into the kind of legend villages used to hammer conscience into their days. Men who had once bought cattle on credit and traded in smug smiles found their faces turned toward the stable, where Alden and the reformed beast now tended. The doctor who had named neglect came daily with salves and measured feed. Children who had once mocked now crept near and stroked the horse's flank, learning the rightness of gentleness by touch. Rook's carved bone became evidence. Its triangles matched a ledger kept by the county constable who had, in years past, received complaints about the ring. The law, slow as river ice, began to fracture under the accumulation of small stones. Men who had once looked away found themselves called to testify. A tavern keeper who had bought a cheap nag confessed to being fooled by Rook's scheme. The village's own sense of measure corrected. Where once profit had been a siren, now the sound was a cautionary bell. Alden worked the long days without boast. He groomed the horse with a care that read like prayer. The brush followed muscles, the curry comb followed memory. He learned the animal's rhythms as a reader learns a text, where stress lay, where tenderness would mend it. He made a collar from an old strap that had once belonged to the mare in the photograph, stitching the two pieces of life together until the seams held. The horse answered with a kind of grace. He accepted the saddle's weight a little longer each day. He stood calm while Alden mended an old wound, and at times, in the hush of evening, he nuzzled the photograph as if he too recalled another's eyes. There were setbacks. One morning, months later, the horse spooked at a thunder that was no larger than a cartwheel's creak. He bolted, and Alden, who had tied him with a new knot of trust, found himself thrown into the mud. Pain flared in a wrist that would never be as nimble as before. Pride cracked like thin ice. Yet each fall taught both of them new politenesses, how to respool patience, how to greet the world after a bruise. The village helped with feed. A widow named Mara brought oats and a quiet word that tasted of old bread. Bonds, Alden learned, are braided from small, repeated mercies. Rook did not vanish entirely from their life. He was taken once to the edge of the law where questions are asked and slips of paper are exchanged. He denied as small men do, and then, faced with witnesses and the weight of his own carved token, he recanted enough to lose favor. He went to another town, rumor said, carrying with him neither profit nor gratitude. His absence was a relief. It was also a reminder that evil sometimes runs with the wind, and sometimes with the sound of a horse's hooves. As winter thawed, the horse grew into a shape that refused the market's earlier measure. He found weight in his bones, and a sheen returned to his coat as if each gleam had been painted by a careful hand. Yet the true repair was not in flesh alone. It was in trust's return. Where before the horse had shrunk at a stranger's touch, now he met hands as if his memory had been rebooked for a kinder world. Children who had once shoved him now offered their palms and learned to wait the small seconds a horse requires before he will accept a new face. Alden's heart, which had been a room with many doors closed, found that one key opened them. He rode at last not to flee from grief but to forgive it. He carried with him the photograph tucked inside his coat, and the knowledge that some wounds do not heal so much as rearrange their furniture until a house becomes livable. He taught the horse to respond to the lightest of cues, not as a taskmaster but as a companion. Together they walked lanes where the hedges bowed and the fields held the memory of the mare's grazing. The village, which had once looked on with detached amusement, now found itself joined in a ritual of small restorations. Market talk changed tone. Men who had once measured everything in coin learned to count by other measures. Acts of kindness, the number of children who could safely cross the road because a horse and man took care. The ledger of daily life acquired new entries, honest and plain. Spring came in a hush that felt like a benediction. Alden led the horse to a field where the grass grew tall and bowed under its own green weight. He chose that place because years before, the mare whose photograph he kept had loved it. It was where she had borne a foal and where, in sun and shadow, she had taught him what a gentle world might look like. Alden unrolled the photograph on a dry stone and set it beside a clump of primrose. He did not perform a ceremony. He made instead a small acknowledgement, the kind that builds the bones of a healed life. The horse stepped forward with the measured pride of one who knows his strength. He moved through the grass like a ship through sleep, nostrils lifting to the scent of earth and newness. Then, as if to show that the last years had altered not the core of his being but its direction, he turned and led Alden by the reins toward the low hedge where the path to the village began. He did not pull, he guided. The act was the story's final echo. The creature, once starved and sold and shamed, now took up the delicate leadership of a man who had offered him a life. Alden understood the symbol even as he felt it. The horse who had been taught to refuse now taught Alden how to accept. Acceptance of past faults and the patience required to mend them. Where once Alden had measured himself by what he had lost, now he measured himself by what he would guard. He had no vanity in victory. He had the steady joy of one who has been trusted back into a world. He set the photograph into the hollow of the stone and, with a voice that was both hymn and pledge, said nothing so loud as to make theater of the moment. The world did not need his oration. The field answered with a scent of new-mown hay and the small exact song of sparrows building nests. The horse stamped once, quietly, and the sound was like a full stop in a long sentence. He turned his head and touched Alden's shoulder with his muzzle, a final punctuation that read as both hello and gratitude. It was the payoff of every smaller seed planted, the boy with the crust, the photograph in the coat, the hand that would not loosen its hold, even when the gavel fell. Alden, who had learned to measure rescue as work rather than miracle, smiled and tightened the strap that bound horse to man, not in servitude but in partnership. The village remembered the story in seasons. When rain was long, they told it to remind themselves of the rightness of small mercies. When harvest came, they told it to teach their children that dignity cannot be sold without consequence. Once a child asked Alden why he had not left when the market jeered. He answered simply, "Because some things are not sold and some debts we pay with hands rather than coin." The child tucked the line away like a seed, and the last thing that happened, the poetic hinge upon which the tale closed, was small and aching and true. The horse, who had arrived to the auction as a silhouette of shame, lifted his head toward the sun and whickered, a sound half honor and half song. In that note Alden heard everything he had waited for: apology from the world, vindication for tender patience, and an entire future braided from two lives that had nearly been reduced to an account. A single line lingered then, as if the earth itself had adopted a Shakespearean cadence and could not let the story go without speaking in one final, ringing tone: "Behold how mercy, though it bend the lowest reed, doth lift again the proudest head. If thy soul was stirred, subscribe and ring yon bell, that thou mayest join us anon for tales untold. If this tale moved thee in modern tongue, if it stirred thee, subscribe, comment, and press the bell, and tell us what mercy hath taught thee."